So it's good to be back in Bristol. This place holds quite some personal history for me because my DJ career pretty much started off in Bristol. I got a radio show on Galaxy 101 back in the day, 1996, and that very much started me on my long DJ career. So I played a lot of the clubs in town. It seems most of them have changed their names now and been taken over, which usually happens, but I do have some fond memories of Bristol from back in the day. Seems to have changed a lot. It seems to be one part George Orwell's 1984 and one part Illuminati Central now, from what I can see, but I suppose that's happening to a lot of cities. So I'm going to be presenting some content from my latest book, Musical Truth Volume 2, this evening, which came out earlier in the year. Volume 1 came out in 2016. 2 years later I've put this one out, and together they represent 7 years worth of research into the true nature of the corporate music industry and what it's really used for. So it's actually not about fun and entertainment and letting your hair down and having a good time, as we're trained to believe it is, but it's all about mind control, social engineering, and all kinds of other shenanigans, as we'll get into. I've been all over the place with this particular talk, so it's good to be touching down in Bristol with it. This is a talk of 4 parts. So the first 2 parts I'm going to do in the first hour or so, then we're going to take a quick break of 15-20 minutes and then come back for part 2. The information I'm presenting might seem very diverse and disparate and all over the place, and you might consider that it can't possibly be connected as I unfold it, but ultimately you will see that everything is connected and it all ties into the big picture of what these industries are used for, and more than that, what's really going on in this world and the nature of this reality in which we find ourselves. A title which you could give to this talk, which pretty much encapsulates the whole thing, is No More Heroes. And that's not me saying, isn't it a shame that there are no more heroes? What I'm saying is, we've got to stop having these heroes, these gurus, these individuals that we place up on pedestals and revere and worship and disempower ourselves to, because time and time again, they let you down. Celebrities and public figures are not your friend. We're entrained and conditioned to think of these people as being on our side and in some way there to improve our lives and improve our situations, but that's not their true role, as we'll see moving on. Here's a guy that knew a thing or two about false heroes and role models and why they're placed in these positions, and social engineering, the systematic changing of cultural values and belief systems and perceptions in the mindset of the general public. Edward Bernays, the double nephew of the famous psychologist Sigmund Freud. He was an Austrian Jew, and he lived from, I've got it here somewhere, 1891 to 1995. So he died at the age of 103. There was no chemtrails in those days, you see, and they didn't put fluoride in the water. But it's interesting how these elite types all live beyond 100, isn't it? And the rest of us don't seem to, but I'm sure it's just a coincidence. So here's a famous quote from Bernays, where he said, "In almost every act of our daily lives, whether in the sphere of politics or business, in our social conduct or ethical thinking, we're dominated by the relatively small number of persons. It is they who pull the wires which control the public mind." And just to expand on that a bit, from the book that he put out in 1928, entitled Propaganda, from the opening page of that, we get this phrase. He said, "We are governed, our minds are moulded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we've never heard of. It is they who pull the wires which control the public mind, who harness old social forces and contrive new ways to bind and guide the world." And he certainly knew a thing or two about how these processes get done. Very much the master of propaganda. He invented the concept of public relations, of corporations and government institutions having this public face and an official version of themselves that they present to the world. Bernays was responsible for so much of that. And it can all be summed up pretty much by the title of these 2 great books put out by the researcher and professional hypnotherapist, Neil Sanders. He put out a couple of books around about 4 years ago called Your Thoughts Are Not Your Own. And that's what we're dealing with here. So most people go through their lives thinking that all the belief systems and the values and the morals and even the prejudices that they have come from them, that they formulated these ideas for themselves by looking around at the world and assimilating this information and coming to these conclusions. It turns out that in the vast majority of cases, all of these things have been fabricated and manufactured for you by those that specialise in making these things happen. So Edward Bernays spoke about it there, and there are institutions which specialise in mind control and social engineering of the masses, such as the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations in London, the Frankfurt School in Germany, aspects of Oxford and Cambridge University, and then over in the States, Yale, Harvard, Columbia, Princeton, the Esalen Institute, SRI, MIT, all these different organisations. And we'll encounter a few of these as we go on. So the first part of this is all about false heroes and role models. And a general rule of thumb is that anyone that has been placed into any kind of public position to the point that the average person in the street has heard of them has been placed there. They've been given that role. They've had that position gifted to them, and in return for it, they're operating to some kind of social engineering agenda or other. And there really are no exceptions. So the individuals that are at the very top of their game, whether it's musicians, whether it's DJs, whether it's actors, whether it's television presenters, whether it's politicians, whether it's TV chefs, they've all been selected for these roles. They didn't get there through hard work. None of it happened by random chance or accident. It all happened according to plan. There was a guy by the name of Yuri Bezmenov, who was a former KGB agent, and he came out a few years ago as something of a whistleblower or an insider, spilling the beans on this plan that the Soviet Union used to have to subvert its political enemies. And there are many different facets to it, but the one of interest here is point 4 on this list, which reads culture, false heroes and role models, addictive fads and mass trends. So he's saying that this was a military grade tactic, and it's far easier to control your political enemies through culture and through entertainment and through fads and trends than it is through hardcore military action, which can be seen and understood and responded to. When people don't realise that it's going on, when it's happening under the radar, and when it's being done under the guise of popular culture and entertainment, it's far more successful in terms of winning over the minds of large numbers of people. We can look at some examples of what are known as lifetime actors. And this is a phrase that was coined by the author and researcher Joe Atwill. He put out a book many years ago called Caesar's Messiah, and he's done some others as well. He's done a whole bunch of radio shows, a whole series of them with Jan Irvin at Gnostic Media, which is now called Logos Media. And those two have since fallen out, unfortunately. It's a long story, but lots of great radio shows and podcasts out there from Joe Atwill and Jan Irvin, where they go into this whole concept of lifetime actors. So these are people that we think of as one thing, whether it is an actor or a politician or a musician or a TV star. And again, you stop the average person in the street and say, have you heard of such and such? And they'll say, oh, of course I have. Yeah, I know who that is. So that's the public version of them, the Edward Bernays version of them, that people are trained to think of. But there's been so much research done in recent years into the family backgrounds and some of the affiliations and associations that these people have. And when you embark on that style of research, you discover some very unexpected things. And when you look into enough of these characters, you see certain patterns and trends starting to form, which enable you to see the big picture of what's been going on here for all these decades. So one example we can look at is Jim Morrison, the singer with the Doors. So it's fairly well known now, largely through the work of the late great Dave McGowan, this author and researcher who put out a book in 2014 called Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon. This was his research into the music scene that came out of Laurel Canyon, a district of Los Angeles, in the counterculture era of the mid to late 1960s. And through that book, he showed that pretty much every prominent musician that came out of that community and were responsible for changing the face of popular music in the 60s had family connections going into aspects of the military or the military-industrial complex or various expressions of the US government. And this was almost without exception. So we're talking Jim Morrison, we're talking Frank Zappa, we're talking John Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas, we're talking Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, the Byrds, Joni Mitchell was involved in that whole thing, Buffalo Springfield, Captain Beefheart, Alice Cooper, the Beach Boys, the Monkees, so many other groups. The connections just go on for days. And if it was just one or two of the fathers of these musicians who were high-ranking military personnel, you could chalk it up as, oh, well, it's just one of those things. A lot of guys did serve in the military in those times. But when it happens time and time again, and when the fathers of so many of these people are not just ordinary rank-and-file foot soldiers in the military, but they're generals and admirals and other high-ranking individuals, then you'd have to be in a pretty heavy state of denial not to accept that there's something you need to pay attention to here. So the classic example is Jim Morrison, and here he is, pictured in January 1964, looking very different to when he emerged a couple of years later as this fully formed, iconic rock god, already with his band, with his songs, all ready to have this influence on culture. Here he was in 1964, looking very clean cut. And actually in that year, he took part in a propaganda film for the University of Florida. You can get this video on YouTube. It's a young Jim Morrison, decked out as this college kid, and he's taking part in this film to try and encourage students to enroll in this particular university. So there he was, an actor right from the start, before he was given this role of being this iconic rock god. Now, here he is with his dad, pictured on the right, and he's on the bridge of his dad's ship because his father was Admiral George Stephen Morrison, and he was in charge of the fleet of ships that was involved in the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which was actually a false flag, and that springboarded America into the Vietnam War, resulting in 10 years plus of mayhem and carnage and the deaths and suffering of untold millions. So how do you reconcile the fact that you've got the guy that was involved in that event and his son is being put out there as ostensibly this anti-war, anti-establishment poster child for that whole counterculture scene that was supposed to be against the Vietnam War and all these other expressions of the system? The only way you can reconcile it is by understanding how the concept of lifetime actors works and culture creation, because all these things are manufactured for us. Here's a quote from Joe Atwill, who I just mentioned, from one of his Unspun radio shows, and I've included this because it really does sum up what we're talking about here in a very impactful way. So he says, Jim Morrison and the Doors. Now you've got the son of the Admiral who led the false flag fake attack in the Gulf of Tonkin that starts the Vietnam War. Who is this guy? He comes out of nowhere, he's very attractive, and he has this appetite for LSD. And because he's a music idol, he influences people. But imagine if he'd come out and said, you know, I'm just the son of military intelligence, and they've told me that they want to have people take drugs, so please take drugs. I mean, if he came out that way, the culture wouldn't move very far. His persona was developed, all the attributes of his character in the media were developed so that he would have the most power in terms of influencing people. And he's far from an isolated incident. I've just used him there because he's one of the best examples we have of this dynamic, but there are many, many others. Another one, which I've picked at random, it could have been anyone else, but this is Joni Mitchell, the famous folk singer, songwriter, and her father was in the Canadian military, and she came from Canada to Laurel Canyon in the same way that so many of these other musicians did. They flocked from all other parts of the US, they came over from the UK, and they all congregated in this small neighborhood in Los Angeles, which just happened to have a covert military base within that community, which was involved in creating propaganda films for the American government during the Second World War. It was called Lookout Mountain. It's now a private residence which is owned by the Hollywood actor Jared Leto. But anyway, Joni Mitchell's dad is pictured here with her as a baby, and he was a link trainer instructor in the Royal Canadian Air Force, and he evidently trained other pilots despite the fact that he was deemed unfit to fly himself. So he's just one of so many examples of fathers in military duty whose offspring become prominent cultural figures. So this is a military-grade tactic that we're talking about here, in the same way that the sons and daughters of high-ranking military officials are put to use on the ground in the army, or they're put into the Royal Navy or the Air Force to serve their duty in one of these obvious expressions of the military. It's also the case that sons and daughters from important families and with high-ranking fathers are put to use in the entertainment industry. And they're given these roles to influence culture and to affect the public mindset and the way that we think about things and the way that culture is shaped and moulded. It is a military-grade tactic, and these are tried and trusted individuals that are placed into these roles, to have that effect. Moving on to the punk and new wave scene, because this whole dynamic is very far from limited to just that counterculture hippie scene of the 1960s. Looking at punk and new wave, which developed out of New York and London largely, but also there was a scene in Washington DC, I can't think what the connection might be there, and a small scene in LA in the late 70s going into the early 80s. One of the prominent groups coming out of that scene was Talking Heads, and there was a spin-off group of Talking Heads known as Tom Tom Club. And the two consistent members of those groups were Tina Weymouth and Chris Frantz, who were a husband and wife couple. So we can look at the father of Tina Weymouth. This becomes very interesting. First of all, her brother Jan is a Harvard graduate, and he turns out to have been chief of design for the architect I.M. Pei on the Grand Louvre project in Paris involving the placement of the iconic glass pyramid. He also designed the Salvador Dali Museum and the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. Well, what else would you expect the brother of a punk musician to do, right? So Jan and Tina's father, Ralph Weymouth, was a Vice Admiral of the US Navy. I'm getting echoes of Admiral Morrison here. And a master of the Freemason Grand Lodge of Maine. Their great-grandfather was Anatoly Lebras, known as the Bard of Brittany. He married Mabel Davison, the sister to Henry Pomeroy Davison, which brings a link to Yale University and the secret society Skull and Bones. Henry was a senior partner of the banking monolith J.P. Morgan. He worked with the Astor Place Bank, and he was instrumental in the creation of the Federal Reserve System, including attending that notorious 1910 meeting at Jekyll Island that brought the whole thing about. So how many links and connections do you need? And how many of these are you going to chalk up as, oh, well, it's just one of those things, it's just coincidence. You know, we've got Harvard and Yale, we've got Skull and Bones, we've got JP Morgan, we've got the Federal Reserve, and all of this is coming from the family of a punk musician, a new wave musician. You know, not necessarily the links you would expect to find. I always say that, you know, when I think of punk musicians playing gigs in these grimy underground clubs, you know, I would have expected the fathers of most of these people to have come from regular working class backgrounds, you know, to have been miners, labourers, dockers, lorry drivers, that kind of thing. But you never find that. The fathers are always university lecturers, diplomats, government officials. Why would that be? That's not a natural thing. Let's look at Dave Grohl, another good example. As I say, there are many we could choose, but he seems as good as anyone else. Of the Foo Fighters, of course, and previously he was a part of the group Nirvana in the Kurt Cobain years. He was a drummer with Nirvana. So Dave Grohl's father, he was earlier in a punk band out of Washington, D.C., by the way. Again, the question remains, why is so much of that music scene centered around Washington, D.C., of all places? So Dave Grohl's father, James Harper Grohl, worked in politics as an assistant to Robert A. Taft Jr. Robert's father was William Howard Taft, who was the 27th President of the United States. You know, nothing unusual about that. And his father was Alphonso Taft, who just happened to be a founder of the Skull and Bones occult secret society operating out of Yale University. But don't worry, it's just a coincidence and, you know, nothing to worry about. A family which is very much worth looking at when it comes to the whole punk and new wave genre is the Copeland family. You can have days of fun looking at this lot and what they've been involved with, I tell you. So you had this patriarch of the family who was a guy by the name of Miles Copeland Sr. And he was a career CIA agent, very legendary in intelligence circles. He was posted all around the world during his career. His kids were actually born in Beirut, Lebanon, and they attended an American school there, which has turned out a whole bunch of politicians and business leaders. There's something about that particular place. And so Miles Copeland had 3 sons, Miles Copeland Jr., Ian Copeland, and Stuart Copeland. And people will recognise Stuart Copeland, of course, as the drummer with the group The Police. But the interesting thing about the Copeland brothers is that they were all put to work in the music industry in that whole punk and new wave genre, and they had very influential positions. So aside from Stuart being the drummer with The Police, you had Miles Copeland Jr., who ran a record label, he managed many of the prominent bands, and he also had a show on MTV where he would only play music from bands that he managed or had something to do with. They had a holding company for their various activities known as Copeland International Artists, or CIA for short. So they also had another company which they operated through, and they booked many of the bands through it, called Frontier Booking International. And their third company, which they operated, was known as International Records Syndicate. So we have CIA, FBI, IRS, and the police, with Sting, as in a sting operation. As Johnny Rotten said at the end of the Sex Pistols' very last concert in 1978, ever get the feeling you've been cheated? Good night. Now, has anyone wondered why Ed Sheeran is absolutely bloody everywhere? Yeah. All over the radio, popping up at all these festivals. Every time you turn on the friggin' TV, it's Ed bloody Sheeran. Now, why is it that he is so popular and always out there in the public eye? Could it be something to do with Dad, do you think? Well, let's have a look at Dad and who he is and what he's done. So Ed Sheeran's dad is John Sheeran, and from his own website, we can find out in his biography that in 1998, John curated the official 50th birthday exhibition of the Prince of Wales at Hampton Court Palace. And in 2000, he curated Our World in the year 2000, the United Nations Millennium Exhibition. So now we discover that Ed Sheeran's dad has connections to the royal family, Prince Charles, and the United Nations. Now you know why Ed Sheeran is so popular, because his career has been created for him. There have got to be lifetime actor training schools and academies out there where these individuals go to hone their crafts and get very skilled at what it is they do, so that when they're ready to be unleashed to the public, they're ready to go with all these talents intact. So it's probably a form of military boot camp where they're really put through their paces and they become the best musicians, the best actors, the best performers, whatever field it is they're going to be put into. And I've no doubt that Ed Sheeran was put through one of these, as many of these musicians were. There's another link, interestingly, which was reported by that paragon of truth and virtue, the Daily Mirror, recently, where they revealed that Ed Sheeran is linked in some way through his family genealogy to Gordon Burns, who was a TV presenter in the 70s of the show The Krypton Factor. And there's plenty more of that, bloodline links, as we go on. In terms of culture creation, scenes, fads, trends, movements, any kind of situation that sweeps up vast numbers of people in its wake and affects the way they think and the way they perceive things, it's going to be made to happen. None of this occurs by random chance. None of it occurs off its own back. It just doesn't work that way. The control system that we have would never allow any kind of movement to sweep up large numbers of people if it wasn't in some way in control of it, or if it wasn't in some way serving one of their social engineering agendas. And there are no exceptions to that. So a really good study of it would be the whole Cool Britannia bullshit that we had in the mid-90s. So if you recall, round about 1997, I suppose, 96, 97, you had this campaign to get Tony Blair's New Labour Party elected into power and to kick out John Major's Tories. And as part of the campaign to make Blair palatable to young people, there was this social engineering campaign to present him as this really cool dude that was down with the kids, that used to be in a band, used to play guitar, smoked a spliff or two back in the day, you know. So he's down with the kids. He's a cool guy. He's not like these stuffy, boring old Tories, you know. He's someone full of energy that's going to lead this country into the future. That's the image of him that was sold to the public, Edward Bernays style. And the public fell for it, hook, line and sinker. I can actually remember being in Galaxy Radio when it used to be based in Baldwin Street, down the road there. And there were certain other DJs that I used to associate with that were literally partying. The night that Blair's new Labour Party got into power, they were cracking up in the beers, they were full of jubilant pleasure that this guy had got in, you know, and how they were had, you know, how they were mugged off, as we discovered just a few years later. But that's how successful these campaigns are, and they really do win people over. So as part of this campaign to make Blair appear cool, he held this reception party at Number 10, and he had guys like Noel Gallagher of Oasis coming in. And this was in the era of Britpop, where you had Blur and Oasis, and we were presented with this idea that Britain is going through this really exciting period of cultural change through the music. It's the most dynamic period since the Beatles and the Rolling Stones in the 60s. It was all manufactured, and it was all a construct. So yeah, that pretty much sums it up, doesn't it? Feel free to laugh at the gags, by the way. It was very interesting to me that the singer of the group My Bloody Valentine, Kevin Shields, came out a few years ago in an interview with The Guardian, offering the opinion that Britpop was pushed by the government. So he actually said, you know, this was a construct to get Tony Blair's new Labour Party elected by tricking large numbers of young people into thinking that he's a dude that was going to represent their interests, you know. So interesting that we have somebody within the public eye coming out and making that public statement. And here, of course, is Noel's brother, Liam, in a picture which he may now regret. I certainly hope he does. See, none of these people are who you think they are. And the only way to not consistently get bamboozled and mugged off and disappointed is to let them all go. Throw them all out. Because people always say, oh yeah, I realise that most of these people are created and, you know, served up to us, but not my particular guru, not my particular holy cow that I place on a pedestal. Everyone's got someone about whom they don't want to hear it. But you come to realise that they all come from the same place and they're all doing the same job. You've got to get rid of them all. It's not to say you can't continue to enjoy the music or the movies or whatever, and I'll get to that at the end, but the individuals, you've got to stop putting them on pedestals. They're not who you think they are. Damon Albarn of Blur, the other big group of Britpop. So he's generally thought of as being a bit of a political activist. He's against homelessness, he's campaigned against that. He's against austerity and all this kind of thing. Help the homeless, the establishment is corrupt. And OBE, why thank you, Mum. So, I don't have a picture of it there. But Damon Albarn, in the Queen's New Year's honours of about 3 or 4 years ago, went along to Buckingham Palace and quite happily took an OBE from the Queen. So how does that work? You're anti-establishment, you kind of, you know, fuck the system, but you'll have a medal from the Queen. Doesn't quite work out, does it? And the whole system of honours and knighthoods, OBEs, MBEs, sirs, lords, is a very strange thing when you actually apply some critical thought to it. When you throw out the Wikipedia public relations version of it, which is, oh, these people are national treasures and they're being awarded for their services to culture and how they enrich all of our lives. You throw all that BS out and you look at it for what it is. These are awards given by the British Empire, which has been one of the most murderous and destructive forces on the face of the earth in human history, responsible for raping and pillaging foreign lands and untold misery and suffering all over the world. In my book, that's not really something to be proud of being associated with. Personally, I would not want to have any kind of connection to that type of institution. But it seems these celebrities have no such qualms. So here's Ringo Starr just the other week up at the palace, getting his knighthood. And notice how they're always on their knees, kneeling in subjugation, to the royals as they pick up their little trinkets. And there he is, flashing his medal with the peace sign. Peace, man. Yeah, because the British Empire is all about peace, right? And here's another one. When you throw your rotten eggs and tomatoes, can you make sure it goes this way, please? And they miss me. So here's Bono giving you a couple of little visual indicators of what he's all about, who really owns his arse, and the type of character he really is. We think of him as a rock singer, but there's so much more to know about him. And I could do a whole presentation on him. So nothing to see here, please move along. Something that's been quite shocking to me is the fact that in recent years, DJs have been starting to get MBEs and OBEs. When it comes to looking up to public figures and revering your personal icons, I've been just as guilty as anyone else of doing that. And with me, it was DJ heroes, because I was a radio and club DJ for 20 odd years. I still do a bit of it, but I don't get booked for so many gigs these days. I can't think why. Is it something I said? But I used to look up to guys like Pete Tong, long-standing Radio 1 DJ, extremely high profile, extremely influential in the dance music field. So 4 years ago, he turned up at the Palace and he was awarded his MBE along with a bunch of others. So you now have Norman Jay, who's a DJ out of London, who's picked up an MBE. You have David Rodigan, who's a legendary reggae DJ. White, middle class, son of a British Army officer, public school educated, was an actor before he became a DJ. Enough red flags there for you? He's now an MBE. You have Jazzy B of Soul to Soul. He took the MBE. And you have Goldie, the drum and bass DJ and producer. So there he is, up at the Palace. And here's Goldie in the guise that we normally think of him as. Fuck the establishment, stick it to the system. He's edgy, he's dangerous, he's all of that. But there he is, taking his little medal from Prince Charles. So just the same as all the others. When there's a medal on offer, it's amazing how much these street credentials just get tossed to the side. This is borrowed from David Icke, but it kind of makes the point. Both sirs, Sir Jimmy Savile, Sir Edward Heath, but I'm sure the Queen knew nothing about it. I'm sure she feels really embarrassed that she gave both these guys knighthoods. I'm sure it troubles her day and night that so many of them just slip through the net. And they only ever seem to catch them when they're dead, don't they? Because there's no living ones. Nobody alive is up to all this stuff, it's only the dead ones. I'm not allowed to mention Cliff Richard in this talk. Blame it on the bloodlines. Yes, it's all about family genetics. It tells us so much. So let's look at some incredible examples of family links. Now this is absolutely true, and it was reported in the mainstream media. Not that I'm saying stuff that's reported in the mainstream media is necessarily true, but I'm just pointing out the fact that this didn't just appear on conspiracy or alternative media outlets. It was reported in the national press that David Cameron is 13th cousins with Kim Kardashian. Who knew? How crazy is that? And this just speaks to the way in which different expressions of important bloodlines going back into history through generations are put to use in various public roles. Again, to have an influence on culture and societal values. So with this family, you have one descendant of this particular bloodline that is put to use in the world of politics, British Prime Minister David Cameron, and the other one is Kim Kardashian. Whatever it is she does. Not entirely sure what she does, but she's famous anyway, and you've heard of her. And you could go out in that street, stop anyone and say, have you heard of Kim Kardashian? And they'll say, yeah, of course I have. That's all you need to know. If the average person in that street has heard of them, they've been placed there. Now, it also turns out that David Cameron and Boris Johnson are 8th cousins, but it's just a coincidence. So David Cameron, Boris Johnson, and George Osborne all attended Oxford University in the same year, and they were all a part of this fraternity within Oxford University known as the Bullingdon Boys Club. It's kind of the Oxford equivalent of Skull and Bones at Yale. So out of this society, you get David Cameron emerging as British Prime Minister a few years later, Boris Johnson emerging as Mayor of London, and George Osborne emerging as Chancellor, all coming from the same place. But don't worry, because we live in a democracy and we're free to choose our leaders, and we can exercise our choice when we vote, and everything's fair and above board, honest. Prince Charles famously came out a few years ago through the mainstream press declaring that he was descended from Vlad the Impaler, Vlad Dracul of Transylvania, around whom the legends of Count Dracula are based. And he came out with this stuff with apparent pride. He loved the fact that through the Queen Mother's bloodline, he was descended from Vlad the Impaler. And evidently, he's been out to Transylvania in Romania several times, and he's kind of like a patron of various communities out there, and they love him. He's a public hero in Romania. So it's not something to particularly shout from the rooftops in my book that you're descended from this horrific guy and all the things that he got up to, but it doesn't seem to have bothered Prince Charles. So here is Prince Charles pictured on the left, and we have Vlad the Impaler on the right. I always throw that gag in. And I put this one in at the time of the royal wedding the other week as well. That seemed to go down quite well. These gags don't work overseas, by the way. Some of these are very British. It turns out that you can learn a lot from looking at who prime ministers' wives are as well, not just the prime ministers themselves. But this came from a site called the Occult Beatles, which is run by a good mate of mine, Matt Sergiu. I've done many interviews with him. And he did a long article looking at the Profumo affair of 1963, which was immortalised in the movie Scandal. It was all about Christine Keeler, this escort call girl, I guess, that was having an affair with both a British government minister and a Russian diplomat at the same time. And it was a big potential breach of security, and it made the headlines in 1963. It was a big scandal. So it also involved this guy, Stephen Ward, this society osteopath. And on his site, Matt says that during Stephen Ward's trial in the summer of '63, Mandy Rice Davis appeared in the courtroom. It was put to her that Bill Astor of the Astor banking family had denied ever being involved with her. He died, this is Bill Astor, in 1966, and his son William succeeded him as Viscount. Now, in the 1970s, this guy married Annabelle Lucy Veronica Jones, and she had a daughter from a previous marriage whose name was Samantha. And a couple of decades later, she just happens to pop up as the wife of the British Prime Minister David Cameron. So you've got these links going into the Astor banking family and the whole Profumo government scandal, and links going there into David Cameron. And another Prime Minister's wife that's worth looking at, although I've had it on authority from an insider who's in a position to know that Tony Blair is 100% gay, and that his marriage to Sherry is a complete sham, just there for public relations. Apparently, they don't even live together and never have. They just come out together for the cameras. That's what I've been told. Anyway, at least in terms of his public profile, Tony Blair's wife is Sherry Blair, born Sherry Booth, and it's been shown by genealogists that she just happens to be descended from John Wilkes Booth, who is the guy who is said to have assassinated the US President Abraham Lincoln. So a few generations later, an expression of that particular bloodline family crops up as the wife of a British Prime Minister. You see, none of these people get there by accident. None of them get there through hard work and crossing their fingers for good luck. They're placed there because they're wanted to be in those positions. They're created for them. As George Carlin so astutely observed, it's a big club and you ain't in it. And that's your biggest blessing. You wouldn't want to be in this club. Trust me. In a few radio interviews that I've done recently, I've reflected on this crazy, upside-down, satanically inverted reality in which we live, where everything is the polar opposite of what it should be. Everything is flipped on its head. You know, you've probably heard the famous quote from Michael Elner where he says, you know, just look at us, everything is backward. Doctors destroy health, universities destroy education, governments destroy freedom, and all this kind of thing. So everything is the opposite of what you'd expect it to be. So isn't it interesting that so many people look up to celebrities and public figures and they think, I wish I was rich and famous and successful like them. So many young people have dreams of being a successful pop star, successful actress, whatever it is. I think the truth of the matter is that so many of these people in these roles, politicians, actors, TV stars, musicians, probably spend their time wishing they could be like the rest of us, wishing they could have a life where they're free to do whatever they want to do. I'm sure many of them would give up the mansions and the yachts and the speedboats and the sports cars if they could just return to a normal life where they could pop down Tesco's for a loaf of bread and a pint of milk whenever they feel like it, instead of being in these high-profile positions where their every move is scrutinised and they're instructed in what to do. They're told what they need to put out there into the public. I think it's a pretty hellish existence to be in one of those positions, and I certainly would not want to be in any of these places. So it's a big club, and thank God I'm not in it, and thank God you're not as well. As Bono said tonight, thank God it's them instead of you, right? Camera on, camera off, there you go, it's all an act. This is Bohemian Grove, this gathering in California, which takes place every summer, where politicians and business leaders and the so-called great and good and rich and famous all gather for a few days in this area of privately owned woodland, and reportedly they put on robes and indulge in all kinds of rituals, but it's basically a breeding ground for future leaders, and it's one of these places similar to the Bilderberg Group and the Council of Foreign Relations and groups like this, where they get together and discuss how they're going to change society and what plans they've got for the rest of us in the years ahead. This picture is from 1967, and seated at the table you see on the left of the guy that's standing, Ronald Reagan, and on the right, Richard Nixon. So both these guys went on to become American presidents subsequent to this meeting. Does anyone still believe that presidents are elected rather than selected? These people are served up to the public. It makes no difference if it's America or Britain or anywhere else in the world. These people don't get there through the public exercising their choice because they have no choice. This is the choice you get. Do you want this particular member of the Skull and Bones Secret Society out of Yale University, or do you want this member of the Skull and Bones Secret Society out of Yale University, presented to the American public in the same year? That's your choice. It's as good a choice as Trump versus Hillary, right? And it doesn't really matter who you vote for because the control system gets in either way. Now, I just wanted to leave you with one final example of these bloodline family links before we move on. And this one concerns a producer in Britain of the late 1950s, early 60s by the name of Joe Meek. There's lots to know about Joe Meek. He met a very undignified end. He was implicated in a scandal involving a paedophile ring, which reportedly was associated with various politicians. That's a bloody surprise, isn't it? And various other famous people. And when it seemed like the net was closing in on him, he evidently decided that he wanted to do away with himself. So he got a shotgun, which was evidently given to him by one of the members of this group, the Tornadoes, Heinz Burt. This was the group that he managed. And he reportedly blasted the landlady of his lodging house to death before turning the gun on himself. As I say, there's lots to know about his background. But the most high-profile group that he managed was the Tornadoes, best known for the UK #1 single Telstar. One of the band members of the Tornadoes was a guy by the name of Rob Huxley. Is the name Huxley ringing any bells? So in his online autobiography, you find out that Rob notes that some digging into his genealogy revealed that, wow, would you believe it? I'm glad you're all sitting down. He's a fourth cousin of the Brave New World author, eugenicist and co-architect of the CIA's MKUltra mind control program, Aldous Huxley. What were the chances? You know, what are these people doing cropping up in pop groups? You got Aldous Huxley coming out of that family that's all about eugenics, social engineering, culture creation, academia. Why is a cousin of his turning up in a bloody pop group? You know, it shouldn't be happening if all this is random and accidental, which it's not. So culture creation and lifetime actors, some examples. And one of the best that we can look at in terms of a textbook example of how all this gets done is the counterculture hippie scene of the mid to late 1960s coming out of California, which I referenced briefly earlier. So that whole scene, with psychedelic rock music and folk rock as the soundtrack to it, was absolutely laden with LSD and other hallucinogenics which just seemed to appear out of nowhere overnight and were everywhere. One of the cultural heroes of that whole period was Dr. Timothy Leary, who was a Harvard professor, reportedly kicked out of his position in academia because of his stance on LSD and other psychedelics, where he was encouraging his students to take this stuff and saying it's a wonderful thing, you can go on these journeys of self-discovery and expand your consciousness. So he was very much a poster child for that whole thing. And it's been shown by so much documentation that's come to light, including some admissions from Leary himself in interviews that he gave in later life, that he was operating to a very large degree under the direction of the CIA. He was an asset of the CIA. So that agency had an interest in large quantities of LSD getting out into the youth population of the US at that time, in tandem with other major social changes that were taking place. And none of these changes were by accident. It's a very interesting video that you can get on YouTube. It's called Mkultra Reunion Party. You could do a search for it. This video is from 1979. It's in black and white, but it's some home footage shot at a party that Timothy Leary was hosting with a whole bunch of his cronies and colleagues from back in the days of Mkultra and this whole counterculture thing. And they're all sitting around, basically patting themselves on the back at a job well done. And they're pretty much admitting to how it was that they changed the culture of those times according to an agenda that they were working to. And most of these dudes that he's sitting around with are speaking with high society, public school British accents. So they're coming out of MI5, MI6, British intelligence, and they probably have links to the Tavistock Institute. And there they were working with Leary, connected to the CIA, to make all this stuff happen. Another character from those times was Robert Gordon Morrison, and he was a propaganda officer for JP Morgan Bank. That was his day job. But one of his extracurricular activities was pushing psilocybin mushrooms, magic mushrooms. He went down to Mexico on this legendary trip in 1957 and reportedly met with some of the shamanic cultures down there and learnt how they ingested mushrooms and other plant medicines in order to access higher consciousness and all of this. So he brought the idea of mushrooms back to the United States, and it was very much popularized through a Time magazine article in 1957, May 1957, where he got to speak of this trip and how he was trying to get American kids to embrace mushrooms. This was all completely contemporary with the arrival of LSD everywhere. And it turns out through documentation that's been uncovered by Jan Irvin and Joe Atwill that that whole trip down to Mexico was funded by the CIA as part of Sub-Project 58 of their Mkultra program. So the pay requisition for Gordon Morrison exists and is available to view to show that he didn't go there off his own back, out of personal interest. He was sent there by the agency. Why would that be? You know, the CIA and MI5 and MI6, we think of these organizations as there to protect us. They're supposed to represent our interests, keep us safe from harm. So what are they doing? Putting LSD and ecstasy and other things out into the market and trying to change culture in that way. That should not be a part of their remit, but we find they do it every day. Another very highly revered cultural icon and consciousness guru is Terence Mckenna, held in very high regard. I'll just give you a quote of his here, because he was around in the 60s and he was talking about how great it is to be taking all these hallucinogenics and stuff like that. He cropped up again when the whole acid house rave culture had got going in the UK in the early 90s. He appeared at a series of lectures in London in 1992 titled Evolution. And in these, he stated, with electronic culture, you can create shamans for the global planetary village. And this, to my mind, is the function that rock and roll played in the 60s and house music should play in the 90s. And he went on to talk of physiologically compatible rhythms. Sound can actually change neurological states in large groups of people getting together, creating a telepathic community of bonding that would hopefully be carried out into the mainstream of society. So he's talking about what happens when large groups of people get together in a communal situation, they pool their consciousness, everything is being energized by drugs that these people are on. So the kind of consciousness that's being created and the kind of experiences they're having are being dictated by the drugs that they're on, and also the visuals that they're exposed to, and very importantly, the sound frequencies and the rhythms. He's talking about how that was a big thing in the 60s, and now it's a role that house music should play in the 90s. A big red flag to suggest that the acid house, rave, dance music scene coming out of the UK in the late 80s into the early 90s was a construct every bit as much as the counterculture hippie scene, the psychedelic era of the 60s was. It was the same blueprint, it was the same template that was rolled out a generation later on the other side of the Atlantic, and it absolutely bears all the hallmarks of a military intelligence social engineering creation. This is a big part of my new book. I spend 2 chapters looking at this whole acid house rave scene and examining some of the evidence for it being a big psyop. And believe me, it's one I was taken in by, because in the late 80s I lapped all that stuff up. I got turned on to that music. I enjoyed going to those parties, and it's a big part of my life, as it was so many other people. And it's only in recent years, with the benefit of hindsight and maturity and having done the research, that I've come to understand how I was made a mug of and once again fooled, as we all are in so many ways. You know, there's no shame in admitting that you were mugged off. The dignity comes from accepting that it happened and vowing to never let it happen again, because now you know better. Back to Mckenna then. Here's a comment that he made when he was lecturing at the Esalen Institute in California in 1994. He says, when I reached La Carrera in 1971, I had a price on my head by the FBI. I was at the end of my rope and they recruited me and said, you know, with a mouth like yours, there's a place for you in our organisation. And I've worked in deep background positions about which the less said the better. And about 15 years ago, they shifted me into public relations and I've been there to the present. So Terence Mckenna has since passed away, but here he is in 1994, pretty much admitting that he'd been doing work for the FBI. So is there a high-profile consciousness guru with a prominent position that doesn't have some kind of connection to the CIA, the FBI, or one of these other intelligence agencies? It seems not. As Jan Irvin observed when he guested on the Corbett Report some years ago, this pretty much is an extension of what I just said about vowing to never be bamboozled again. He stated, 10 years ago, I released 70 hours of Terence Mckenna audio to the internet. Now, in hindsight, I'm looking at all of his research and everything going, my God, look what he was into. So it's my duty, having discovered that I was mind-controlled myself, to put this information out to help others. And they may hate me for it in the interim, and trust me, you get a lot of hate doing this work. But I think that the people who take the time to actually read the information and look at it closely will find it very liberating, because it's much easier to spend a few hours or days or weeks researching facts than it is to spend a lifetime believing lies. That's why I do this work, and that's why many other researchers do it as well, because you take on a responsibility when you discover these things to share it with others and give people the opportunity to take on these understandings for themselves. Many people choose to reject it, many people don't want to hear it. You start talking about one of their personal holy cows and they're just going to shut down and not want to have that conversation. But I and the other people doing this type of work are offering the opportunity for people to, come to these comprehensions if they choose to. It's always down to free will choice. But you can't say you weren't told. Let me skip through a bit of this. This is all to do with the counterculture hippie scene. You had the Grateful Dead, who were, again, this poster group for that whole scene. Their followers were known as Deadheads. I think there's a bit of a clue in that title. And this group was absolutely a construct. They came out of the CIA. 2 of their members have direct family connections to the CIA. There's connections into Bohemian Grove. And the road manager for some time for the Grateful Dead was a guy by the name of Alan Trist. His father, Eric Trist, was one of the founding members of the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations in London, which is this think tank all about culture creation and social engineering. Another road manager for the Grateful Dead in the early years, when they were known as the Warlocks, was a guy by the name of Hank Harrison, who just happens to be the father of Courtney Love, who was the wife of Kurt Cobain. Gloria Steinem, thought of as the mother of feminism, the whole feminist movement. She had Ms. magazine, and she was hailed as a cultural icon for feminism. Well, it turns out that whole thing was a construct as well, and that Gloria Steinem, documentation has shown, which is available, that she was in the employ of the CIA. She was, once again, an asset. And the whole idea of feminism was not about equal rights for women and empowerment. It was actually about getting women into the workplace so that they could be contributing to the taxation system. And it was also, a big part of it, to do with breaking up the traditional family unit, getting mums out of the home, away from nurturing their children and into the corporate workplace, giving their kids over to the state for daycare so that they can begin the indoctrination of children at an ever earlier age. That's what that whole scene was actually about, but it was presented under the guise of empowering women. But it's all bullshit. So the acid house scene, as I mentioned, there are so many parallels to that earlier 60s scene. We get it through some of the imagery. We get it through the fact that in the 60s you had psychedelic rock as the soundtrack of choice. In the late 80s it was this new breed of electronic dance music that was coming through. In the 60s you had LSD everywhere. In the late 80s you had ecstasy, MDMA, ease appearing out of nowhere, absolutely flooding the scene. In the 60s you had hippies all sitting around in communes and at festivals getting high on acid, tripping out to this music. In the 80s you had kids at raves, open air festivals, getting off their tits on ecstasy and listening to all this electronic dance music. Exactly the same blueprint with just the fine detail tweaked. We can look at some of the imagery that was used in the early days of acid house, such as on this flyer from the Theatre of Madness, Spectrum, this iconic acid house club night presented by Paul Oakenfold, one of the original architects of the acid house scene, which morphed into the whole electronic dance music scene that we now have. You've got this all-seeing eye that was originally used on a poster by the Grateful Dead, throwing back to the 60s. I'll just skip past that bit. Here's some ecstasy pills with individual engravings, sigils engraved onto them. I'll speed some of this up. It's probably worth just going through the first bit of this, which is an extract from my book. Any social movement which dictates or coerces the value systems or behaviours of entire groups of people will have been engineered into place by an organisation such as the Tavistock Institute, the Frankfurt School, the Fabian Society, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Stanford Research Institute, the Esalen Institute, Cambridge, Oxford, Yale, Harvard, Berkeley or Princeton universities, or some other think tank. If this is the case with all celebrities, all social and political movements, and any kind of fad, trend or scene, why would anyone reasonably expect things to be different with any kind of music movement which emerges very rapidly to unite and give a cultural identity to massive amounts of people, particularly if it ends up having marketable appeal in pretty much every country in the world? I'm talking about the massive worldwide electronic dance music scene that we now have, which is popular literally in every corner of the world. You have these big festivals, these big events where hundreds of thousands of people at a time turn up, and they're all exposed to what is now electronically produced music, which is digital in nature. It's all about the sound frequencies that are loaded into these recordings. The drugs are still there, ecstasy is still out there along with others, and it's very much to do with the visuals and the themes of these events happening on these massive scales. So here's some examples. This one is Digital Dreams. Look at some of the names of these events which take place all over the world and notice the themes and the patterns which emerge. Dream State in California, Trance Nation, Velvet Hypnotize, Atlantis Spring Awakening, Awake, Awakening Fridays, Dream Beach, Delirium Eternity, Electronic Family, Digital Society, Digital Dreams, Tomorrow World, Tomorrowland, Future Music Festival, New Horizons. And look at the geographical spread of these events, everywhere from Australia to Argentina to the Netherlands to Leeds just the other week, Digital Society. So it's everywhere. What you notice is constant references to digital electronic ways of doing things and ideas of tomorrow and the future. And what the electronic dance music scene is being used for now, all over the world, is to normalize and make appealing the idea of transhumanism and artificial intelligence and the smart grid Internet of Things reality into which we're moving very rapidly. This scene is aimed at young people because young people are much easier to shape and mould and manipulate than their older counterparts who are a little bit cynical and a little bit world weary and have seen a thing or two. But when you're young, you're absolutely rife for manipulation because you just want to have fun. And if a scene is presented to you as fun and great and inclusive, you're going to fall for it. I did, and so many others have. But what I believe, the whole acid house rave culture thing, which emerged 30 years ago, so 1988, was known in the media as the second summer of love. There's another clue in the title. And it was the very early humble beginnings of a scene which snowballed very rapidly and caught on all around the world and is now absolutely under the control of social engineers. It's all involved with getting the younger generation ready for transhumanism and artificial intelligence and the singularity. It's making it appear cool, it's making it appear normal, it's getting young people entrained to think of electronic digital ways of doing things as really great, as the future, so that there will be little to no resistance when this agenda is fully unfolded, as it is being now, very rapidly. That's what that whole scene was used for. And any kind of movement or scene like that has to have its leaders and its Pied Pipers up there at the helm to lead the kids off in certain desired directions. David Guetta, superstar DJ, would be one. You look at these big dance music gatherings and they actually resemble religious ceremonies where you've got the throng, the congregation all gathered down there. And up at the DJ booth, which is something like an altar in a church, you got the DJ assuming the role of a preacher or a religious leader. And all somebody like David Guetta's got to do is hold his hands up like that in a gig, and he can get 100,000 people to do exactly the same thing. He'll start clapping his hands. 100,000 people will start clapping their hands at his cue. That's how easy it is to mind control large numbers of people under the guise of entertainment and just having a good time. And of course, these people are chosen. So David Guetta, there's no way he just worked really hard and kept his fingers crossed for good luck and just happened to get into that position. And it's the same with all of these. So you have Paul van Dyk, DJ producer out of Germany. He has a cult-like following. You can look at comments on his Facebook page and people are literally saying things like, "I would die for you, Paul. You are my God, Paul. I named my firstborn child after you, Paul." This is the level of worship that people have for these false heroes and role models that served up to them. Paul van Dyk, we'll get back to this logo shortly, just want to go into what that logo is all about. But he's got a record label called Vandit, and he's put out many different releases from various artists. But one thing you notice from the imagery on the sleeves is it's always the same themes being projected. futuristic cityscapes and hints at transhumanism and alternate realities. This is the idea that's always being pushed because that's what his role is. It very much puts me in mind of Metropolis, this iconic movie from Fritz Lang coming out of Germany in 1927, which depicted a futuristic cityscape very similar to the one being peddled on those Vandit record sleeves. And here we are nearly 100 years later, seeing the narrative of Metropolis starting to play out into reality. So there was foreknowledge there of the type of society we're moving into, the merging of humanity and technology nearly 100 years ago. So back to this Paul van Dyk logo, when you flip it on its head and you invert it, it becomes very similar to this logo that I dug up that was used by British military intelligence, MI5, from the 1950s through to the 1970s. So you've got this interesting pyramid type effect with the two triangles cut out in the corner there. And in the MI5 logo, you've got a capstone with an all-seeing eye in it for nice decorative measure, you know. But it doesn't just stop with Paul van Dyk, because you've got this American-Japanese DJ producer called Steve Aoki, and on a flyer to one of his gigs, he's used exactly the same symbol. You've got this pyramid thing, two triangles cut out in the corner, a capstone with an all-seeing eye at the top, and rays of illumination coming out of it. Is that just coincidence? Probably not. Just finally, for this section before we take a break, extracurricular activities. So I've mentioned lifetime actors and the fact that they are served up to us and they're given these roles. And so often the roles that you see them fulfilling are very different to the way that they were initially presented to us. So Bono, for instance, first came out as a rock singer, but now you see him hanging out with US presidents and doing work with the United Nations and hanging out with Bill Gates and getting involved in eugenics operations and things like that. What's that all about? Bill Gates, well, he's just that nerdy computer guy that invented Microsoft, right? Well, there's a little bit more to know about him. Bill Gates is a eugenicist as well. His ethos is all about population reduction and getting rid of undesirable aspects of society. It's very much the mindset of Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, and it turns out that Bill Gates' father, William Gates Sr., was a founding member of Planned Parenthood, which stands for those principles. So there's another gag for you. Bill Gates' true nature. Skip through some of these. We've covered Bono in Rotten Eggs, hopefully. Arnold Schwarzenegger, well, he's just a bodybuilder turned actor, isn't he? Just made it big in Hollywood, crossed his fingers for good luck, got a few gigs. Little bit more to know about Arnold Schwarzenegger as well, particularly if you can judge a man by the company he keeps. What's he doing hobnobbing with these types if he really is just a humble Austrian bodybuilder? Here he is picking up a trophy at one of the first bodybuilding contests that he took part in. 1967, I think this was. Look who's handing him the trophy. And what an interesting handshake. There's more to know about all of them. They get wheeled out whenever they're needed. So Paul McCartney, whoever he is, we'll get to that, gets wheeled out the other week at this anti-gun rally, March for Our Lives. There he is in New York, waving around banners. Now, it's just a guess, because I can only speculate, but I think he was probably told to get his arse along to that. I think it probably would have been a requirement rather than a personal choice. As I say, that's just me speculating, but from what I've seen of the way these lifetime actors operate, when they're given a job to do, they step to it, because that's what they're all about. There's another McCartney gag. That one does work in the States. This one doesn't, because they don't know what Faulty Towers is. It's all something for another talk. And here we are, vegetarian activist, worked in an abattoir. Brilliant. Natural bedfellows, right? Please spare a thought for the homeless. Bob Geldof, well, you know, he was presented to us as this scruffy, out-of-tune singer from this Irish new wave band, the Boomtown Rats. Then he did the whole Live Aid Band-Aid thing, and he was presented to us as a national treasure, Saint Bob, this lovely, caring fella that just wants to help people, you know. But there's a little bit more to know about him. I do go into him in volume 1 of the book, and it turns out he's just another actor. He's just doing what he's told, and he crops up in different circumstances, pushing different agendas as they're needed. So most recently, he's been out there endorsing smart meters and trying to get the British public to take a smart meter into their home. Come on, folks, you know, it's a great thing. It's going to lower your bills and make your life more convenient. So that's his latest job. Smart meters are not a great idea. I'm sure we all understand that, but they're really not the thing to have. Richard Curtis, married to Emma Freud, who is the daughter of Sir Clement Freud, who was exposed as a paedophile recently, but only after he died, mind. And he was a Sir as well. So Richard Curtis is very much involved in Red Nose Day, the whole comic relief thing coming out of the BBC, and there's much more to know about that, particularly when you get into the true nature of the BBC, who have this lovely, heartwarming statue outside of their broadcasting house HQ in London, depicting a grown male with a young, naked male child writhing against his crotch. I suppose it does quite sum up the BBC, you know, fairly well. Jimmy Savile, we all know about him, Rolf Harris, and Gary Glitter. All of them fronted the BBC's Children in Need campaign. Unbelievable. Right there in plain sight, there they are, imploring the general public to part with their cash for all these poor kids in needy situations, and they're the ones creating the needy situations. A few final examples. Russell Brand, lifetime actor to the core, mind control handler of Katy Perry, and so many other things. I don't know how many red flags people need, but you could write a catalogue of them. One of his most recent roles has been to endorse this whole transgender, non-binary, gender fluidity, social engineering, Tavistock bullshit that we have in society. And he announced that he was going to raise his forthcoming child as gender neutral. And we're supposed to believe that was a personal decision that came from him, rather than an instruction that came from his overlords. It just smacks of yet another psyop in terms of the way society is being taken. There are many more examples of it. We'll discuss some of them as we get on in part 2. So Russell Brand, you know, like I said, how many clues do you need as to what he's really all about? This whole gender fluidity, non-binary thing is very far-reaching. It is a major priority, it would seem, for the social engineers at this time. We have Skepta, who's a grime artist coming out of London. This genre historically has always been thought of as very masculine, full of macho bravado, you know, tough and streetwise and all that kind of thing. So recently Skepta turned up at this industry event wearing women's knitwear. And the interviewer said, you know, what's all this, Skep? What's going on? He says, yeah, I'm rocking this women's knitwear. I'm gender fluid these days, you know, non-binary, like you do. So it's obvious. He's been given this script. He's been told to go out there. He's been told to talk about gender fluidity and all this kind of thing, in line with all these other changes that are taking place in society, to have an influence on the young people that look up to him as a hero and hang on his every word. So if Skepta says it's okay for guys to wear women's knitwear, there's going to be a whole bunch of impressionable young minds out there that think, oh, well, you know, if Skepta's doing it, it must be okay. And that's the way societal values get changed. This is, glad you're sitting down, Young Thug. He's a rapper out of the US, and his artist name is Young Thug. And here he is being pictured as Little Bo Peep in a friggin' dress. This is an agenda. There is an agenda to change attitudes towards sexuality and gender. It goes way beyond personal individual choices and people expressing themselves the way they see fit to. It's mind control. It's conditioning people to think in certain desired ways. That awkward moment you realise your truther heroes are shills, because unfortunately when it comes to lifetime actors and it comes to people inserted into different scenes and movements, it's no different in the so-called truth community. And there are certain high-profile researchers and speakers in this game that I've had to reevaluate as well. So there really are no exceptions, and you have to be very careful about who you, disempower yourself to and put up there on a pedestal. So just summing up this whole section then, when you learn about how lifetime actors and culture creation work, the question becomes, are you happy you were duped and taken into confidence by these people? And would you like more of it? Or are you rather hacked off that you were treated as such easy fodder? And now that you understand how the game is played, do you resolve to never be fooled in the same way again? I think I said something along those lines a bit earlier. So no more heroes is the only way to not get fooled by these people. You've got to throw them all out. Let's take a bit of a break, shall we, for 15 minutes or so, and then we'll come back for part 2. Thanks. Lots to get through in part 2, but I'll speed it up as much as I can. So let's proceed with it. More content from Musical Truth Volume 2. I've selected some bits that I think transform well into a public talk by way of visuals, and I think you'll find all this stuff quite interesting as well. So this first section is all about Prince and George Michael. You might remember that in the year 2016 we had an unusually large spate of celebrity deaths, particularly in the early months of the year. It felt like every other week some high-profile celebrity was being reported as having passed away in some circumstance or other. And the year was very much bookmarked by the announcement of David Bowie in January and George Michael at the very end, at Christmas. And in April of 2016, we got the announced death of Prince. It was very interesting timing because he's reported to have died on the 21st of April 2016, which just happened to be the 90th birthday of the Queen of Germany. England. You know what I mean. To mark this occasion, there were many monuments and famous places around the world that were illuminated in purple. The mainstream media told us that purple is a colour that's long been associated with royalty, so it was appropriate to mark the Queen's 90th birthday. So you had Niagara Falls in Canada and all these other monuments appearing in purple. We also had a new range of beer known as Purple Rain, R-E-I-G-N, get it? This came from Green King, the large brewery chain, and it was put out into their pubs in time for the Queen's 90th birthday. Then, of course, we get the news that Prince, the artist, has died at the age of 57 in an elevator, like you do. Happens all the time. So it's interesting that we've got the death of a prince announced in coincidence with the birthday of a queen. Prince is an interesting artist to study because, in my view, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that he was mind controlled. He was actually a mind control subject. His music is fascinating to analyse because of the lyrical themes that he discussed. There's a big essay at the end of my Volume 2 book from a guy called Dan Munro, who's done some really incisive analysis into the themes that Prince dealt with. And he identified that most people think of Prince's songs as basically being about sex. He was lascivious and he was dirty-minded and all this kind of thing. But every time on one of his albums that you have a track that deals with sexual sin and promiscuity and hedonism, you seem to have another track that balances it out by talking about God and religion and spirituality. And these themes continued all the way through his canon of work, through 2 decades. Very interesting to look at. Towards the end, in his latter years, he became quite outspoken about a number of things. So there was this famous interview that he did on the Tavis Smiley chat show in 2009, where he starts talking about chemtrails. He's referencing Dick Gregory, this comedian turned political activist, and he said he started paying attention to the work of Dick Gregory, and it turned him on to the idea of chemtrails, the fact that we're being sprayed by these poisonous compounds from above. And he starts talking about this on a chat show watched by millions of people, which you're not really supposed to do when you're a celebrity. The whole situation with Dick Gregory is very interesting. He's credited as one of the guys that first presented the Zapruder film showing the assassination of JFK. This didn't come to light in the public until 1975, some 11, 12 years after the event, and Dick Gregory is one of the guys that first presented this film. So he became this activist himself, and in the light of Prince's death, Dick Gregory was asked to comment on it, and he said he didn't know Prince and he doesn't care for celebrities, he doesn't like to associate with them, so he was quite dismissive about the whole thing. Then Dick Gregory just happened to turn up dead himself. He was 90 years of age, it has to be said, and 90-year-olds do die, but he went into hospital in reasonably good shape and never came out again. So that becomes interesting in itself. But in terms of whether there might be a motive for Prince having been taken out by the controllers of the industry of which he was a part, it certainly seems there's no shortage of them. So every time you hear of a celebrity death like Prince, you get some people saying it happened exactly the way the mainstream media told us it did. He was on fentanyl, he was on these prescription drugs, and it just had a bad effect on him, and he died, just like Michael Jackson did. Then you have a whole bunch of people saying these celebrities don't actually die, they just retire the public persona and they go off to live out their final years outside of the public spotlight under some witness protection program or other. It's all a big hoax, it's faked. Then you have people who will claim every time a celebrity dies in suspicious circumstances like this, they've been taken out. They've been wiped out by the industry controllers. I don't think you can make a hard and fast blanket statement in any of these cases and say artists are always killed in this way or it's always a hoax. I think you need to look at each individual case and study the detail of it in order to come to a conclusion. In the case of Prince, my personal feeling is that he was taken out. And unfortunately, something that I discussed in volume 1 of my book, we do have the concept of ritual sacrifice, which takes place within these industries, where prominent figures are done away with in ritualistic circumstances in line with the occult belief systems of those that preside over these industries, because they are dark occultists at the end of the day. Yes, they are oligarchs and business moguls who like making money, and to a very large extent they exploit their artists to make money out of them, but a large part of what they do is steeped in ritualistic activity in line with the occult belief systems, the religious belief systems that these very sick and psychopathic people at the top of these industries have. And they're not just at the top of the entertainment industry, they're at the top of every aspect of human life: politics, academia, the military, everything. Prince in the mid-90s went through a period where he entered a legal battle with his record label, Warner Brothers, and he was trying to free himself from the shackles of the contract that he was under with them. He was also trying to gain back ownership of his own master tapes. This was a very high-profile battle, and during that period he took to, first of all, changing his name from Prince to this unpronounceable hermaphroditic symbol that he went by, and then he became known as the artist formerly known as Prince. He also took to wearing the word slave scrawled on his face in protest at the way record companies exploit their artists. So he wouldn't have made himself particularly popular with Warner Brothers by dragging them through the dirt publicly like that, in that legal situation. Very similar, incidentally, to the situation with Michael Jackson, who entered into a long-running legal battle with the Sony Corporation, his record label, in very much the same circumstances. And he was making public comments to the effect that Sony were evil, Tommy Mottola, the one-time CEO of Sony and Columbia, was the devil, he said, and Tommy Mottola was a one-time husband of Mariah Carey. And George Michael is another artist who went up against the Sony Corporation and also was trying to free himself from the restrictive nature of his contract. And I don't know if you've noticed, but there's a connection there between those three artists in terms of how it worked out for all of them. But I'm sure that's just a coincidence. An interesting element of Prince's demise is the fact that he died on the 21st of April. So April being the 4th month of the year, if you put that date into the American style of rendering it, it becomes 4/21, April 21st. Prince put out a single in 1984 from the Purple Rain soundtrack called I Would Die For You. And it's been noted that U is the 21st letter of the alphabet. So if you ascribe a numerical value to that letter, it becomes I would die 4/21, or I would die April 21st, which he did. It becomes interesting to speculate. Another thing it becomes interesting to speculate on is what was going on with this particular concert that he did in Utrecht in the Netherlands in December 1998. You can get the audio to this concert on YouTube, so you can take a listen to it for yourself. And at the end of the gig, he says, I'm going to play one more song, then I've got to go. Got to get back to America. Osama bin Laden's getting ready to bomb. Osama bin Laden's getting ready to bomb. So this was the tail end of 1998. It was a little under 3 years before the events of 9/11, which of course were pinned on Osama bin Laden. He didn't do it, but they were just pinned on him. So he was public enemy number one at that time. So this appears to indicate some kind of foreknowledge that something was going to go off involving Osama bin Laden. And the reason you can connect it to 9/11 is because directly after he makes this statement, he adds 2001, hit me. You know, either that is a wild coincidence at odds of several million to one in terms of him getting that information accurate, or Prince moved in such circles as to have inside knowledge of what was going to be coming in 2001. Moving on to George Michael then, at the very end of 2016, Christmas Day, we get the news that he just happens to have died in his bed, of some kind of medication, like you do. So you have a singer, arguably best known for the line, "Last Christmas I gave you my heart," who just happens to turn up on Christmas Day dead of heart failure. But, that's just another coincidence. When it comes to apparent renderings of George Michael's demise in popular culture in the form of what's come to be known as predictive programming. So this is a depiction of a real-world event which is known to be coming, which is encoded into works of culture, whether it's music videos, movies, TV shows, cartoons, promotional photographs, record sleeves, that kind of thing. There is no shortage of this when it comes to the circumstances surrounding the death of George Michael. We can look at a few of them. There was a movie which came out in 2016 called Keanu, this comedy film out of America. And you've got this character in it who is this kind of street gangster, petty crime sort of guy. And the big joke is that he's really in touch with his feminine side, and he actually loves the music of George Michael, which is entirely at odds with his streetwise sort of persona, So in this one particular scene, he enters this altered reality, this alternate form of consciousness, and he appears to have this apparition of a ghostly figure of George Michael in what appears to be heaven. So it's straight out of the video to the song Faith, and you see George Michael at the jukebox, and you hear the song starting to play. And this guy is experiencing, this ghostly apparition of George Michael. What's that all about? Then you have the movie Deadpool, which came out that year. It has a storyline involving bets as to which famous people are going to be the next to die. So this movie doesn't state that George Michael is about to die, but interestingly, the film's main character is portrayed as a superfan of Wham, once again. And then you get George Michael's Careless Whisper playing over the closing credits. You had the musical La La Land, which received its theatrical release over the Christmas 2016 period, and there's a scene where the female lead character yells out George Michael's name for no apparent reason. Just going back slightly earlier to 2013, there was a British comedy film called Having You, and there's a scene in it where these two characters go into a public toilet. And this one guy says to the other something along the lines of, "Be careful you don't encounter the ghost of George Michael." And the other guy says, "George Michael isn't dead." And the first guy says, isn't he? I could have sworn he was dead. What a strange scene to put into a film. And interesting that it's in a public toilet when you factor in the unfortunate incident that we heard about in the mainstream media about George Michael apparently exposing himself to an undercover police officer in a public toilet. Hampstead Heath, I think it was. Then you find that George Michael's music had placements in Zoolander, in the Martin Scorsese movie Bleed for This, and you had Wham's Choose Life slogan coming from their 1980s heyday, cropping up in the first Trainspotting movie. It formed the basis of this long monologue by Ewan McGregor's character in Trainspotting in 1996. Then you had T2 Trainspotting released 20 years later in 2016, and once again Ewan McGregor delivers this long monologue based around Wham's Choose Life slogan. A comment from George Michael's manager, a guy by the name of Michael Lipman, who talked about having struck a deal with the movie makers of Keanu for 4 of George's songs to be featured on that soundtrack. So he said in this interview, the way it was described to me was that George Michael was so cool that even drug lords have got a tattoo of him. They turned George into a cool badass. And he says it's great for George and his songs as people become more curious about his music. And certainly what we saw happen was what always happens when an artist of this stature is announced as having died. Their back catalogue sales go absolutely through the bloody roof. We saw this with Michael Jackson, we saw it with Amy Winehouse, with Whitney Houston, with Prince. It certainly does turn a very large profit for the record labels and everyone involved with it. One final movie placement to mention is the film Atomic Blonde, starring Charlize Theron, which came out in 2016 also. She's playing this sort of MI6 assassin type character, and there's this one scene where she's preparing for a fight with these secret police agents that are coming to this apartment. And to prepare for the showdown, she puts some music on the CD player, and it just happens to be George Michael's father figure. So many references to George Michael and his music, particularly in the months of 2016 leading up to that Christmas Day event. Another thing, in February 2016 there was a tribute to George Michael at the Brit Awards event where they wheeled out Andrew Ridgeley, his partner in Wham, for the first time in 30 years, and you had Chris Martin of Coldplay doing a version of George's song A Different Corner on stage. And during the performance, in the background, they're flashing up different images, and you get this split-second image of Prince from the era when he was battling Warner Brothers and he had Slave on his face. And you just hear Prince saying, "Peace to George Michael." Very interesting. So the official story that we got was that George Michael was discovered by his partner, his boyfriend, this guy Fadi Fawaz. Fadi Fawaz is from Australia, but he appears to be Arabic in origin, and he's said to be a photographer to the stars, and he got into a relationship with George Michael a few years ago, we're told. They supposedly, well, according to Fadi Fawaz's initial statement to police, he spent the night of Christmas Eve 2016 in George Michael's house in Goring, South Oxfordshire, and woke up on Christmas morning and found George unresponsive in bed. And after he tried to wake him, to no avail, he contacted emergency services. Very soon after that, he changed his statement to police. And instead of saying he spent the night in the house with him, he then said he slept in his car all night outside the house. Like you do. I mean, who doesn't sleep in their car outside their lover's house all night on Christmas Eve? You know, we all do it. So that's what he then told the police. And he said that he entered the house sometime around lunchtime on Christmas Day, you know, slept in his car till 12 o'clock or so, as we all do, and went in the house and then found George unresponsive in bed, you know, and then called the emergency services. So in my experience, the police don't take kindly to people changing their statements, and you can probably expect at the very least a night in the cells for doing that. But Fadi Fawaz appears to have had no problem in changing his statement, and it was just reported in the mainstream media quite faithfully. who really was this guy though, and what was the true nature of his relationship with George Michael? Because you've got members of George Michael's family, particularly one of his cousins, who has stated in interview that Fadi was never really George's boyfriend, and none of the family liked him, and they didn't really know where he came from. And when you factor in this picture, which appeared in the Daily Mail, you have what appears to be George Michael in some kind of trance-like state, and he appears to be being led by Fadi Fawaz in a very authoritative situation. So Fadi has taken control of the situation, and this very much smacks of a mind control handler subject type relationship in terms of what we can glean from this photo. And when you look at the high-res version of it, which you can't really see on the screen here, you can see that George Michael has a red mark going all the way around his neck, which is consistent with him having been garroted or had a cheese wire pulled around his throat or something like that. It's right there in plain sight in this photograph. So it does raise some questions as to who this guy Fadi Fawaz really is and how he came into George Michael's life. And shortly after George Michael's announced death, there were stories of the family trying to get rid of Fadi Fawaz out of George's house because he'd taken residence there and they were trying to kick him out. And then Fadi Fawaz was making a series of very bizarre tweets saying that he was broke and he didn't have enough money to put petrol in his car or to buy a pint of milk and stuff like that. And he was saying things like, one of these days the truth will come out. Well, it hasn't yet. All we're left with is a whole bunch of questions. And this is always the case when a music artist passes away before their time. It becomes ridiculous. Michael Jackson was 50. Whitney Houston was 48. Prince was 57. George Michael was 53. These are not natural ages at which to die. And every time we get another of these stories, it's just packed full with anomalies and discrepancies and strange elements that just make no sense and remain unexplained. We had another one in January this year. The singer with the Cranberries, Dolores O'Riordan, turns up dead in a hotel room in London. Death by hotel room, which seems to be quite a common thing in the music industry. Thinking back through the ages, you've got the likes of Janis Joplin, Michael Hutchence, Whitney Houston, a few others I've forgotten, but so many people that just turn up dead in hotel rooms. Chris Cornell would be another one. And it's very often the same. You get family members saying that these people were in good spirits. Somebody had spoken to them the night before they supposedly committed suicide or overdosed, because those are the two consistent factors that we always hear about, and they were making plans for the future. We got that with Chris Cornell. First of all, his wife Vicky stated that he was in good spirits and he was making plans for the future, and then he's said to have hanged himself in his Detroit hotel room. We get the same thing with Michael Hutchence, who went out to dinner with his family the night before he was discovered dead, having apparently hanged himself in a Sydney hotel room in 1997, full of good spirits, making plans for the future. And it's the same thing with Dolores O'Riordan, who'd come over to London. She was going to work on some musical collaborations. She was full of plans for the future. And then she's discovered dead at the age of 47 in her hotel room in the Hilton on Park Lane, London. There's been no adequate explanation for this. All we got in the mainstream media was reports of the police saying there was no suspicion of foul play, and they're not treating the death as suspicious. Because, 47-year-olds turn up dead in hotel rooms all the time, right? We were told that the coroner's report into the cause of death had been put off until April. April comes along, we're now told that it's been suspended indefinitely. So we don't know how she died. We've not even been given a cover story for it. And what's going to happen is it's just going to fade in the public's memory and people will just forget all about it. And if somebody mentions her name in a few years' time, people will have this vague, woolly idea of, oh yeah, didn't she turn up dead in a hotel room? What was it, drugs or something like that? Because this is so often what we get. It's the same with Whitney Houston, with Amy Winehouse. People have this vague idea that it was something to do with drugs because they can get away with it when it comes to musicians, when it comes to rock stars. People think this lifestyle is all about living life in the fast lane and drugs and crazy parties and all that, this kind of thing. So it's not surprising that one or two of them turn up dead every now and again. That's how they can get away with so many musicians turning up dead in all these strange circumstances. It wouldn't be so easy when it comes to people like plumbers or washing machine technicians. You know, if a bunch of washing machine technicians kept turning up dead in hotel rooms, people would be saying, why are so many washing machine technicians dying? But we don't get that kind of scrutiny with musicians. People just go, oh well, just the way it goes, it's the business. Here's an interesting picture of Dolores O'Riordan, who would appear to be yet another, asset of the industry controllers. They do like to place their little calling signs and their symbols right there in plain sight. And another one from this year is Avicii, the Swedish dance music DJ and producer. He turned up dead on the 20th of April, so that's the day before Prince's date of death. It's a very interesting period, that, running from round about the 22nd of March, just after the spring equinox, 322, a number heavily associated with skull and bones coming out of Yale, all the way through to the 1st of May, Beltane, Walpurgisnacht, May Day. That whole period has been identified by many researchers as a favourite period for occult sacrifice. And you find many major events occur in that period in April, round about the 19th, 20th, 21st of April, year after year. So this year on the 20th of April, we got the news of Avicii. And the official story is that he burnt himself out very young. He was only 28 when he died. He became successful and famous very quickly, very young. He was touring the world at the age of 23, 24, and we're told that he just couldn't handle the pressure and the pace of constantly being on tour, constantly being expected to deliver these hits, and he just wanted out of the industry. He'd had enough. He had all these health issues. He's supposed to have had acute pancreatitis. He had part of his liver removed, and he'd had all kinds of other operations. So this is all being offered to us as an explanation for why it is that he passed away at the age of 28. What we got from his family was a statement implying that he decided to take his own life, that he'd had enough of it all, that he couldn't handle the pressure. So he turned up dead in the state of Oman in the Middle East, in a property owned by a member of the royal family of Oman, the Sultan of Oman. And it later emerged, or we're told, that he committed suicide by way of a broken wine bottle. And we're told there were wounds to his wrists and his neck. So, you've had enough of life, you want out, you've got a few options available to you. A bottle of pills would be one. I think if I was ever going to do it, that's the way I'd choose to go. Who is going to choose to do away with themselves with a broken bloody wine bottle? It doesn't strike me as a very realistic version of what went on. And this is always the case. Things just don't add up. There's more questions than answers, and the mainstream account of what happened to somebody just appears to make no sense. So that was Avicii, the latest high-profile one. I'm sure there'll be another one along before too long, and we researchers can spend time, looking at the fine detail of that. But there's plenty more detailed in volume 1 of my book, where I've gone through the likes of Jimi Hendrix and what's said to have happened to Jim Morrison and Elvis Presley and Janis Joplin and John Lennon and Bob Marley and all these others. It is interesting that many artists who become outspoken about the control system and who appear to go off script, like John Lennon, like Bob Marley, like George Michael Jackson made some very anti-establishment comments in his final years. They always just happen to be the ones that turn up dead, But Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr and Mick Jagger and Elton John, no problem. Careers lasting 50 years. They don't rock the boat, you see. If it's spiritually broke, don't try to fix it. So this final section is examining music videos and some of the interesting imagery and symbolism that we get in them. When I first embarked on this research, I spent a lot of time looking at contemporary current day music videos from the likes of Black Eyed Peas, Lady Gaga, Katy Perry, Beyonce, Rihanna, Kanye West, all the usual suspects, all the pop puppets that are served up to us, Britney Spears, Christina Aguilera. And you see the same thing time and time again. All these calling cards of these occult practitioners, these different secret societies, this control system that we have. They do like to place the truth of the matter in plain sight in terms of what they're all about. And they do it by way of things like the one eye and the pyramid sign and the 666 sign and all these other signs and symbols, the Baphomet sign that you see time and time again. There's also a lot of symbolism that pertains to trauma-based mind control and satanic ritual abuse. When you see things like shattered mirrors, this is an indication of the presence of trauma-based mind control, which results in the shattering of a human mind into different compartments which can be programmed with different personalities. It's something that happens when the mind is exposed to horrific trauma. In order to deal with the event, it was discovered long, long ago in the history of mind control that the mind forms itself into these different compartments, and each of these can be programmed with a new personality. You see the likes of will.i.am from Black Eyed Peas rocking that kind of imagery. That was in with Miley Cyrus in one such video. But will.i.am is used all the time to promote transhumanism. He's always put out there as some kind of cyborg or robot, and he's making cool the idea of humanity again merging with technology. It's getting people ready for this artificial intelligence reality. Katy Perry is rocking all kinds of Egyptian mystical, spiritual sort of imagery. This is a Justin Timberlake video where he's got a bloody great pyramid with an all-seeing eye and an illuminated capstone. That's the Sugar Babes depicted as mannequins, dummies. That's another rendering of mind control. Now, I thought it would be very interesting, having understood the kind of signs and symbols and the kind of themes that are communicated through contemporary current day music videos, to look back at previous eras to see whether this same symbolism was right there in plain sight, staring us in the face all along, if only we'd had the eyes to see it and we'd known what to look for. And I decided to look at the 1980s because that was the era where I fell in love with pop music and I grew up watching all this stuff on TV. And you found that many of the videos that were produced in that era were done on a very large scale. They had a lot of money thrown at them. Often they hired established Hollywood producers to direct these videos. And so much of that was down to the advent of MTV, which came along in the very early 80s, and it created this new platform for millions of people to see pop promos from all these big bands of that time. So you started getting very lavish productions in these music videos. I decided to look at a good representative array of these videos, and they didn't disappoint in terms of what I found. So a really good starting point would be Adam and the Ants. This is the video to their song Prince Charming, which was actually filmed in a Masonic temple, and you've got the black and white checkerboard flooring there, which appears in these temples and in so many of these videos. In this particular video, you get a cameo from Diana Dawes, this famous British actress of the 50s and 60s, appearing as a fairy godmother. And Adam is there as this sort of servant in rags, and when she waves her magic wand, he morphs and changes into Prince Charming. And at the end of the video, he changes very quickly into these 4 different personalities. Alice Cooper is one, Marlon Brando from the Godfather movies is another. I think what we're witnessing there is an indication of Adam Ant himself having been the subject of mind control programming. It's on record that Adam Ant is a sufferer of bipolar disorder, and he's discussed it very openly in interviews. He said, yeah, I've got mental health issues, But it strikes me that this is something we get very often as a way of explaining away strange, erratic behaviours, which are actually down to mind control and multiple personality disorder that results from that. This year we had Mariah Carey coming out in an interview and saying, actually, I've been a sufferer of bipolar disorder for many years. She's someone that's exhibited some very strange behaviours. She went a bit mad on stage in 2001 and started rambling incoherently on the mic. There were also reports of her trying to kill herself that year, and she had to be taken away for rehab, which is code for going back into the laboratory to have your mind control programming topped up. And I think when artists speak of bipolar disorder, it's a way of explaining away why they behave in certain ways. It becomes very interesting to look at Adam Ant's father as well, who's the guy here on the right, Alfred Leslie Goddard. So Adam Ant's real name is Stuart Goddard. This guy served in the army, in the military. I know it's hard to believe, but he did. He was also implicated in a paedophile scandal which erupted in the mid-80s, and he actually went to jail for his part in a group of paedophiles that were procuring children for sexual abuse by politicians and, other so-called elites. It was linked to that whole Dolphin Square Pimlico scandal, and Adam Ant's father had connections to this notorious paedophile by the name of Sidney Cook. So that's a pretty damning thing. Here we've got the military merging with aspects of mind control programming, merging with pedophilia. And you often find that where there's one of these elements, the others are never far from the surface. They all seem to be intrinsically linked. Another artist that is interesting to look at is Kim Wilde, real name just plain old Kim Smith, the daughter of Reg Smith, but better known as Marty Wilde. And he was an artist in his own right in the late 1950s, marketed very much as a kind of British Elvis. So his whole family was pushed into the music industry, and Kim Wilde became a very popular singer in the early 80s. Here she is in a video for one of her early songs called Checkered Love. And in the video, you get the same black and white checkerboard flooring that we see on Masonic temples and which crop up time and time again in these music videos. And it's a rendering of the idea of duality in nature, in creation. The idea of black and white, good and evil, night and day, male and female, everything in this realm of existence, this form of reality, takes the form of duality. Everything has a polar opposite. And these are spiritual, metaphysical principles which are studied in Freemasonry and other mystery school teachings. But they also crop up quite a bit in pop videos, it turns out. One thing which you also see very often is elite-style masked balls of the type that we saw in the movie Eyes Wide Shut from Stanley Kubrick, where he seemed to be giving us a glimpse into some of these get-togethers and some of these parties that these elite types get involved with. We see many of these in music videos as well. Just going to skip through a few of these because there's a lot of detail and we're a bit short on time. This is a video to Madonna's Like a Virgin, which was pretty much her breakthrough hit in 1984. In this video, she's in the streets and the waterways of Venice, on gondolas, gyrating on boats, and getting romanced by this guy. But you also see a lion roaming the waterways of Venice. And at one point in the video, this guy that's romancing her changes so that he's got this kind of animal head. He becomes this hybrid, this human-animal hybrid. It's really quite creepy. That's a close-up of it. And we see this in many places as well. This is from another Stanley Kubrick movie. It was The Shining, where you got this very disturbing scene, which is, best erased from the memory. And you got this guy in some animal suit with this elite type getting up to who knows what. And then, of course, we had the movie Eyes Wide Shut with this masked elite-style ball. And we see all this stuff cropping up in music videos as well. We can go back to Ultravox, Vienna, 1981, where you've got this gathering at what appears to be one of these Rothschild-style mansions. And you've got this assembling there, right in the midst of the new Romantic era and all the imagery that came through that movement. Adam and the Ants again with Prince Charming. You've got the checkerboard floor. You've got him swinging from the chandelier in this mansion-type setting. This becomes very interesting. If you do a Google image search with the phrase Rothschild Ball 1972 or Rothschild Party 1972, you get all these images, and they're evidently from this one particular gathering where the Rothschilds and all their elite mates got together and put on all these animal heads and got down to all this business. I don't know about you, but this isn't my idea of a party. I think I'd rather stay in with a mug of cocoa and have an early night than turn up to one of these. But, each to their own. And this is what went down at this one particular gathering. These are all photos from this 1972 event. This is one of them, and it's very interesting because not only does it very much resemble a scene from a recent video by Katy Perry for her song Bon Appetit. I think I've got the... Yeah, this is a still from Katy Perry's video, and you've got her laid out on a table as if she's about to be eaten. It's hinting at cannibalism. You've got an image very similar to that from this Rothschild party in 1972, and it all very much ties in to the spirit cooking dinners that we heard about at the tail end of 2016, very much connected with the Pizzagate child trafficking scandals, and involving this witch by the name of Marina Abramovich, who apparently used to hold these parties where she would have a cake fashioned in the form, I'm just seeing if I've got an image of it here, it seems I haven't, but she would have a cake fashioned in the form of a naked female, very similar to this, and the attendees to the party, who included the likes of Gwen Stefani, Debbie Harry, and other, famous celebrities and musicians, would take a knife and cut pieces of this cake and eat it. So again, very strong cannibalistic overtones. I've also heard about some of the stuff that goes into the makeup of the cake, and I think I'll be passing on a slice of that, thanks. Another video that becomes very interesting to look at is 1984's Self-Control by Laura Branigan. It might as well have been called Mind Control, because that's what it is. It studies the relationship between a mind control victim and her handler, and it becomes very blatant. We can see what's going on here. This particular video was directed by William Friedkin, who was the Hollywood director of the movie The Exorcist, and also The French Connection and many other famous Hollywood films. So he was drafted in for that one. This one is very disturbing. It's one that was brought across my radar by a listener to my work a few months ago, so I put it into the presentation. It's a video to the song Duel by a German group called Propaganda, and it came out in 1985. What's disturbing about it is not the fact that the band are performing on a Masonic checkerboard floor. That's bloody old hat, we've seen that so many times. But about midway through the video, you get this scene, for no apparent reason, completely unrelated to the song, where this young girl in a nightgown is seen walking through this sea of hands, and the hands are all reaching out and they're touching her, and she's very disturbed by it and very bothered by the fact that she's getting molested by all these hands. Next thing, you get an image of this little girl in a mirror. Very quickly, she changes into the lead singer of Propaganda, Claudia Brücken, in the mirror, indicating that she's the little girl grown up, And in the next scene, you get this old lady, this granny, and she takes a doll, a plastic doll, and smashes the mirror with it. When you see dolls and teddy bears, particularly with broken limbs, with an arm missing, with an eye missing, you remember the emblem for the BBC's Children in Need is Pudsey Bear, a teddy bear with an eye missing, a bandaged eye. These are all emblems of satanic ritual abuse of children. And the teddy bear and the doll are a motif for childhood innocence, which is shattered, which is lost when the child begins to be sexually abused from a very young age, which unfortunately is absolutely rampant throughout the entertainment industry and in all other walks of life as well. What we've got here in this Propaganda video is an indication of lifelong satanic ritual abuse from childhood into adulthood and all the way through into old age. And when the old lady is smashing the mirror, we again have an indication of these shattered, fractured personalities and these different alters of the mind which come about through mind control programming. So there it all was, right there in a pop video from the mid-1980s, and 99.9% of people watching that in 1985 would have no idea what was being communicated to them. But nevertheless, it was being subliminally absorbed into the subconscious mind of the viewing public, and these ideas were being put out there. It's only now, with the benefit of having been able to do this research and to be able to share it widely, largely as a result of the internet, that we can start to come to an understanding of what's been staring us, right in our faces, in this case for the past 33, interesting number, years. More from Madonna. Here she is messing about in a Masonic temple. No great surprise. We have more checkerboard floors here. This is from Madness, from one of their early songs, The Bed and Breakfast Man. Interesting group name, Madness, the Nutty Boys. Is there more there to know? I don't know. But one of their videos, to Tomorrow's Just Another Day in 1983, had the group in white suits against a black background. And when you get the black and white duality transposed against each other, this has been identified as a mind control trigger. So it brings forth the programming in somebody that has undergone that. There are various different types of triggers. It can be a word, it can be a phrase, it can be a piece of music, it can be a colour, it can be a pattern, it can be something like this when you see the black and white together. Elsewhere in the video, the group are spinning umbrellas in their white suits. And again, a spinning umbrella has been identified as a mind control trigger. And this is an image that was made by a survivor of satanic ritual abuse from childhood. And she did a bunch of drawings to kind of get it out of her system and express herself. And it's interesting that she chose to depict a black and white checkerboard floor. She's got black and white clothing and there's spots of blood on the floor, and you know, she's appearing sad and distressed. Very sick stuff, and it's been right there embedded in music videos all this time. Duran Duran, interesting group to study. Why were they so big in the 80s? Why were they so influential at that time? Did they get there through hard work and good luck? Or were they chosen ones that were served up to us, going back to what I was saying in part 1? The most interesting video to look at from Duran Duran would be Union of the Snake, which is a title that David Icke would love, I'm sure. So in this particular video, you've got the group out in a remote desert location, and all around the sand dunes, you've got this kind of lizard hybrid entities that are crawling around all over the place. Then the group descend in an elevator several stories below ground. They go deep into this underground base, very similar to what we've heard about Area 51 and all these other deep underground military bases, and they encounter all this stuff in there. Among the things they encounter are a juggler decked out in black and white clothing, another mind control trigger. We also see children in nightgowns being kept captive in cages. And at one point, the children get led out of the cages and they appear to be in a sort of mind controlled trance as they walk through this deep underground base. Very disturbing, very unsettling when you start to do the research into what really goes on in this world of ours. What was it doing right there in a pop video from Duran Duran all those decades ago? A few other examples we can just skirt through here. Interaction between artists and puppets and ventriloquist dummies. Note the black and white suit. This is Thomas Dolby from Hyperactive, interacting with a dummy version of himself. Multiple versions of the artist on screen at the same time. Again, hinting at fractured personalities, mind control, dissociative identities. Kate Bush, same way. No different to any of the others. Billy Idol. Bucks Fizz, the land of make-believe, as in, you know, trauma-based mind control fantasies and alternate realities maybe. And an interesting artist to throw into the mix would be Gary Newman, who emerged in the late 70s with synthesizer electronic music, a very early version of electronic dance music through his hits. So in his videos, you've got various different versions of him on screen at the same time. You've got black and white duality and all of that, pyramids. But the interesting thing about Gary Newman, to me, is his chosen name, because his real name was Gary Webb, like the famous journalist. He chose to become Gary Newman. He spelt it N-U-M-A-N. But I think what was being communicated there, given that his music was very futuristic and technological, is new man, as in one augmented in the phrasing of transhumanism to something more than human. The merging again of humanity with technology that we're seeing through artificial intelligence and the internet smart grid. I think Gary Newman was a very early forerunner of what was known to be coming in the society we now have. Again, going back to Fritz Lang's Metropolis. A few more here. This is the Eurythmics, and Annie Lennox of that group was a very early pusher of transgender imagery. We had David Bowie, of course, doing it in the 1970s, but in the 80s you would have Annie Lennox blurring the lines between masculinity and femininity, wearing suits such as this. And all these globes appear in these videos. What can that be all about? Videos to do with mind control, full of globes. Can't think. Belinda Carlisle, Heaven is a Place on Earth. You have all these creepy ass kids in face masks with globes, and they arrange them in the form of a pyramid. And this is Bonnie Tyler's Total Eclipse of the Heart. Interesting stuff going on there. The Bee Gees, You Win Again, absolutely full of subliminals, flashed up on screen in a split second, including some dominoes with the figure 666 on it. What else could it possibly be? So, wrapping it up then, breaking spells and severing ties, because that's what it's all about. The reason I put all this stuff out there, and the reason other researchers do as well, is to get all this stuff out of the confines of the subliminal mind into the conscious mind, where it can be properly understood. And when you do that, you kind of break the magic spell and the controlling effect that this stuff has on you when it remains in the subconscious. When it's in the subconscious, it's having an effect on your thoughts and your behaviors and even your actions without you being aware of it. But when you can understand the tactics and the methods that were used and the tricks that have been played on you, you break that spell and it no longer has that effect on you. It's like discovering how a stage magician or illusionist does their tricks. Once they've explained it to you, that trick's no longer going to work. The next time you see it, you're going to know how it was done. And it's the same with all this stuff. What I was saying about that propaganda video from 1985, all these years people have been looking at that scene of that little girl in the video and not knowing what it meant, but now we can understand it. And it doesn't have to be affecting us in the same way that it used to. A couple of great lyrics to leave you with. There is still good music being made. You don't hear it on the radio, you don't see it on TV rotation, you don't hear it ringing off down the club. But if you do the digging and you know which artist to look for, and I would say the Conscious Music podcast that I put out, The Sound of Freedom, is a really good source for this music, you can discover real artists still making meaningful message music. One of them is a female rapper by the name of Elias Clay, and in one of her tracks she says, "To be honest with you, I don't really know how we're going to change this, but we have to." And that's a lyric that really resonates with me. Another one I love is going back to the 80s from Tina Turner's We Don't Need Another Hero from the Mad Max 3 movie, where she says, "We are the children, the last generation, and I wonder when we are ever going to change." This lyric speaks to me so much because it reminds me that the generation which we all represent is the last one that retains any kind of living memory of the way society used to be before all this transhumanist AI madness started to come in. We can remember how it was possible to actually get by in life without technology ruling every single aspect of what you do, and electronic digital ways of doing things, and people walking around with their face buried in a bloody smartphone dictating every aspect of their lives, not interacting with other humans and not taking a role in society the way people used to, but being absolutely dominated by technology, which is exactly the way the social engineers want it, because they're changing our reality. And we are the generation that is going to decide whether that whole plan unfolds the way it's meant to, or whether obstacles are placed in its path, and whether we take back some power in the numbers that we have and we resist these changes and don't go down this dark and dangerous road that's been laid out for us. Because young people are being entranced and seduced by all this technology. They're being primed for the 5G smart grid that we've got coming in, and they've been programmed to think of technology as your friend, there to improve your life, there for convenience. And I think those of us of an older age group that are capable of critical thought, that have done some of our own research, can see that there's a different aspect to this story. And we're the ones that are going to decide the way it all pans out. That's pretty much all I have to say about it. I usually finish on this one. I think we've got to be out of here fairly soon, but we might have 5 minutes or so for some questions. I won't do it over the mic, but if anyone wants to come up and speak to me at the end, feel free to. A few more books left. I'm giving away some posters because I've got too many. If you want a free one, come and grab one. Other than that, thanks for coming out this evening. Thanks for listening. Thanks to Dan for organising, and good night.